Tanks are cool, and super heavy tanks even more so. Fortunately, Warhammer 40k is full of them, but I still had a hankering for something just a little bit bigger. So when Games Workshop sent me this box of new Fronteras terrain, I had an idea. One part of the terrain box was this large bunker section. It was covered in pipes, rivets and panels, all of which reminded me of the rugged aesthetics of Imperial armour. But this alone would not give me everything I needed to produce an oversized AFV of my own creation. I would need to lean on some existing components somewhat, which is where the Baneblade kit came in. While the bunker provided me with the main structure, this kit would give me access to the weaponry and track sections I'd need to create something that looked at least vaguely functional. I began by first removing and cleaning up all the parts required to build one of the two track sections of the Baneblade. These were then assembled as per the instructions, which left me with this. With half of the running gear built, I brought in the main bunker section in an attempt to figure out how these totally different kits could be brought together. After a little fiddling, I found that I could attach one of the shorter side panels of the bunker and have this act as the front of the tank. However, to make the bond between the scenery piece and the tracks a little better, I clipped away the areas of the front panel where it intersected with the protruding axle of the track's sprocket. This initial cut was pretty rough though. I tried not to cut away too much first, as I could always make further cuts after. These first few cuts did give me a much better idea of where my next few trims should be made. After making a few pencil marks to help me out, I continued to make my cuts until the front panel was better resting against the track section. From here, I could clip away and assemble the second track section. With this done, I drew out a rough template on some paper and used this to ensure that the cuts I'd made to one side of the tank were repeated identically on the other. After the cuts had been made, I could glue the front of the bunker to its top section. At this stage, I could compare the bunker section to the two track sections to give me a much better idea of how the profile of the tank would look. This also revealed that some of the support struts on the underside of the bunker were getting in the way of the two parts joining properly. I marked out which struts were causing problems before clipping them away and double checking the fit once again. This process of comparison and adjustment to the parts was continued. Each time I removed small parts of both the bunker and the track sections, slowly improving the bond between the two. After a lot of trimming and tedious adjustment, I finally had a good fit. Now I just needed to attach everything together, which was easier said than done. I had no real way of connecting the two track sections. I couldn't just use Baneblade parts as I'd widened the tracks considerably. To remedy this problem, I dry assembled the tank and made sure that everything was lining up as perfectly as possible. I then measured the space between the two track sections, paying close attention to not knock anything as I did so. This gave me a distance of 12 centimeters. With this measurement taken, I began to cut up 12 centimeter sections of sprue and glued them between the two Baneblade parts. This process was repeated many times. I made sure that each sprue cap was flat and square and rested them on a small ridge that ran along the inner side of the track sections. You don't have to use sprue here, feel free to use plastic rod, dowel or whatever sturdy material you have to hand. The aim here is just to create a strong and rigid bond between the two halves, which I achieved by laying down many sprue rods to create a kind of scaffold. Once I was happy with the strength of the ad hoc scaffold, I could finally glue the bunker parts to the Baneblade parts. This would further strengthen and complete the main structure of the tank. From here, I could begin to fill in the gaps, starting with the rear of the tank, to which I simply attached another one of the bunker walls. This left a few gaps towards the rear, just behind the tracks. These gaps were filled in by taking the bunker's long walls and sawing away just the final section, using the buttress as a guide. Once they'd been removed from the rest of the wall, I returned to the near mind-numbing task of comparisons and trims. With this completed, I could glue the rear sections of the bunker into place. Now that I had the bulk of the tank completed, I now needed to attach the main armament. To house this, I turned back to the original Baneblade kit and took the parts required to build the superstructure of the Shadow Sword variant. Most of the structure could be attached directly to the top of the model, but the front panel would need a little adjustment. I compared it against the depression in the centre of the bunker and marked out a couple of grooves. These were clipped away and compared again. From here I could see that some more drastic cuts were required, which were performed using my saw. I also sawed away part of the superstructure's rear panel in order to create a flat base. After making these adjustments, I then assembled the whole superstructure together and ensured that the structure was still fitting nicely against the top of the tank. My intention could then be moved onto the weapon itself. I wanted something equally huge to match the massive frame of the tank, and so I took some of the chimneys from the Alchemite Stack scenery kit. This needed to be trimmed down a little low in order for it to fit into the opening of the superstructure. After removing some of the bolts and shaving down the width a little, the cannon was fitting a little better. From here, I assembled the two parts of the chimney stack together before attaching the Shadow Sword's cannon, practically doubling the length of the gun. From here, the miniature was almost complete, but the largely flat surfaces could still be improved with a few additional components taken from the Baneblade kit. I added some extra details towards the rear, such as pipes and fuel barrels, as well as some exhaust in the centre. Finally, a few extra front plates were added towards the front of the tank in order to fill out some of the gaps. And with that, the model was ready to be painted. But before we go on with the conversion, let's hear a little bit about the sponsors of today's video, HelloFresh. When I'm not working, I'm probably spending my time kitbashing or editing these videos, so the quick, easy and affordable meals from HelloFresh are perfect for me. HelloFresh offers a wide variety of quick and easy recipes, including 20-minute meals, easy cleanup and low prep options. HelloFresh has helped me to free up the time it would normally take me to come up with a meal idea and go and actually get those ingredients, which just means more time for kitbashing. I get all of these fresh ingredients delivered straight to my door. Another major benefit is that everything is already portioned out, which means everything gets used and there is much less waste. Since using HelloFresh, I hardly have any food waste anymore, but if you don't believe me, even the University of Michigan says that HelloFresh cuts down on your food waste by at least 25% when compared to grocery shopping. Most importantly, it tastes great too. HelloFresh has got more 5-star reviews than any other meal kit, so you know you'll get something delicious. Produce gets from the farm to your doorstep in under a week, so you know that it's going to be at peak freshness. But what's great about getting sponsored by HelloFresh is that we've already been having meals from them for the past 6 months. Before HelloFresh, we used to get stuck in a rut of eating the same boring meals week in, week out. But since signing up, we've enjoyed so much more variety. All of these recipe cards are all different meals we've had and enjoyed. It's been great to try out new meals and things that we would never have tried cooking before. But just take my word for it. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code WARGAMER16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Once again, that's HelloFresh.com and use code WARGAMER16 for up to 16 free meals and free surprise gifts. Big thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Being such a large model, it made the most sense to break out the rattle can to quickly and easily cover those large areas. Specifically, I chose to use some matte black primer from Colourforge. This was used to cover the entirety of the vehicle, giving it a better surface to paint onto and a good colour to begin with for the dark scheme I was looking to create. With the primer complete, I could start to lay down the actual colour of the tank. Well, I say colour, but what I actually meant was grey. Specifically Tamiya's IJN Grey. This was spooned into my airbrush from the pot, along with a few drops of Tamiya thinner to help it through the nozzle. This was then lightly sprayed across the entirety of the tank's armour. I tried to avoid covering over the tracks and the main gun, but these would be painted over later on anyway. Additionally, I also avoided spraying into the recesses. By keeping them darker, it would help to create shading and boost the level of detail. From here, I then chose another Tamiya paint, Ocean Grey 2. This was again thinned out and sprayed onto, predominantly, the centre parts of the armour panels. This just helped to build up the gradients that I'd started in the last step and helped to pick out a few of the key details. I wanted to create quite a grimy and dark look to this vehicle, and the first step in doing this involved creating a mixture of two contrast paints, Wyldwood and Black Templar, which resulted in a very dark brown tone. Along with a little airbrush thinner, this mix was then sprayed into the recessed areas of the tank. This resulted in a subtle brown tone on the surface and gave the appearance of a thin layer of accumulated grime and dirt. It also helped to add a little variation to the colour of the tank surfaces, avoiding an otherwise bland appearance. This concluded the base colours over the armour, which meant that I could focus on some other parts. But in order to protect the paint that I had already laid down, I began to apply some masking tape around the areas that I intended to spray, specifically around the base of the gun and around the track links. The gun was first sprayed with an all-over base coat of Vallejo black. This was followed by some Vallejo black grey. With this very dark grey, I targeted only the top side of the cannon, mainly along the centre. I pushed this highlight a little further by mixing in some ice yellow into the black grey to create a lighter grey. Again, I used this paint to paint the centre of the cannon, further reducing my area of focus to that centre line. I then finished off the airbrushing for now by painting the tracks using some saddle brown. This reddish brown colour gave them a slightly rusted and dirted appearance, an effect that I'd be building upon at a later stage. In addition to these larger areas, the model also featured lots of smaller details that could also be painted up with the same colours and highlighting steps. As such, I used my regular brush to pick out the various small pipes, lights and exhaust, making sure to slightly water down each of the paints before application, just to help them flow and cover more easily. At this stage, everything on the model had been painted, but it was lacking any extra details like battle damage or weathering. Before I began to add these though, I opted to add a few decals first. These would allow me to apply the weathering over the top, helping them to blend into the model more realistically. I cut out a few transfers, and once I decided where to apply them on a model, I applied a little gloss varnish to those areas. This would create a smoother surface to add the decal to, and would help to reduce the ghosting effect that applying transfers can sometimes create. I then left my decals to soak in some water. Once the transfers were lifting from the backing paper, I applied them to the previously varnished spots and left them to dry. But to create that painted on look, I would need to use some microsol. This mild solvent is painted onto the decals where it will soften them and allow them to conform to the surface beneath. You might need to do this a couple of times to get the best effect, but once everything is dried, you can fix everything into place with another coat of varnish. The first weathering to perform was some chipping. I created a mixture of the Ocean Grey 2 that I used earlier, along with some Flat White to create a slightly lighter blue-grey than I'd applied earlier. Instead of applying this with a brush, I dipped a torn piece of foam sponge into the paint, removed some of the excess, and then lightly dabbed this foam across some of the tank's edges and surfaces. This left behind small irregular flecks of paint across the hull. By using a slightly lighter paint than before, these stood out and created the appearance of damaged paintwork. To create the appearance of deeper scratches, I mixed together some black and flat brown. I then painted this on and around the previous flecks of paint. This resulted in the effect that the paint had been removed completely in some areas, exposing the armor beneath to the elements. I used this in a series of thin horizontal lines too, to give the impressions of scratches in the tank surfaces. Finally, I created a mix of black grey and white before sponging the resulting light grey across the barrel of the gun. But before I could begin to apply some oil washes, I needed to prep the surfaces of the tank with another gloss varnish, this time all over. This will not only protect the paint that I had already applied from the thinners, but it will also prevent the oils from pooling and staining the currently matte surfaces. Once again, I applied this all over with my airbrush. My oil wash was created by mixing a little black and burnt umber into some odorless thinner. You can use pre-made oil washes here if you prefer, but it's quite easy to mix up your own. Also, make sure you use synthetic or old brushes for this to prevent damage to your bristles. With the wash mixed, I could target it directly into the recesses. Here, assisted by the gloss varnish, the wash was pulled into them and away from the flatter surfaces. This targeted wash helped to darken down these areas and create the appearance of shadows, adding a great depth of detail to the model. After the washes had been applied, I then began to apply some surface streaks. With some unthinned burnt umber oil, I added a few small spots of the paint across the hull. I then switched over to another clean brush that had been moistened with thinners and dragged it down across the oil spot. As oils can be reactivated and adjusted with thinners, this created a downward streak that resulted in the appearance of rust or grime. Additionally, you can also use this property to clean up any mistakes you might have made with the previous washes. Following on from the oil washes, I then made a few rough edge highlights to some of the edges around the tank and the tracks. By giving these areas a shiny silver appearance, it would give the impression that some damage was more recent and hadn't had a chance to corrode yet. The final step was to add some dust and mud to the tank, but first I gave everything another coat of varnish just to seal those oil washes in. Over this, I then sprayed a few layers of some chipping fluid. Chipping fluid, once dry, can be removed quite easily with a coarse bristled brush, even when it's been painted over, which is precisely what I did next. With some green ochre and a little thinner in my airbrush, I lightly sprayed this greenish tan over the bottom parts of the tank and the tracks, essentially the areas where you'd expect dust to be churned up and then settle onto. These areas were then brushed over with a coarse hog hair brush. Because of the chipping fluid, this removed fine streaks of the green ochre. This created the appearance that this dust had been scratched away as the tank trundled through obstacles or was hit by small arms fire. The model was then finally completed with a coat of matte varnish. This sealed in that last coat of paint and removed the glossiness left behind by the earlier coat of varnish. This all left me with this. And here we have the completed Stormsabre. I've always loved super heavy tanks, so being able to create my own was always an ambition. Whilst working on this idea, I imagined how the purpose of ancient siege engines could be reimagined in the 41st millennium. This vehicle wouldn't be used to take on enemy tanks and infantry, rather fortifications or even titans. While I don't have any rules in mind for this vehicle, I think it would work well for some thematic games. Maybe where an entrenched enemy must destroy the tank before it was able to fully power up over several turns before unleashing its devastating weapon upon their defensive positions. Now, I'd love to hear what you thought about this guide, and if you have any ideas for other large-scale conversions you'd like to see me tackle in future videos, then please do let me know in the comments below. I'll include all the paints used in this guide in the description, along with some affiliate links, so if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself while supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Seth Sewell, Broken Astartes, Ryan Little, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Mr. Grimm, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me through Patreon, through channel membership, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the tools and paints required to create these big conversions for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.